Greetings sailors and welcome back to World of Warships and another random replay plucked from replayswows.com. This time it is a game in the Ohio and it's a very good game, but a big part of also why I chose it was that I don't think I've actually shown off the Ohio on my channel before. It's one of the Research Bureau ships. It's a tier 10 battleship and it's essentially a Montana hull with the same 18-inch guns that you find on Georgia, and also basically the same secondaries that you find on Georgia as well. It's got the improved dispersion and range of the Massachusetts/Georgia. Doesn't have a speed boost though, and there's also a rather crucial difference in the heal. It doesn't have the improved heal that other US battleships do have, but it does have a much shorter cooldown, which I think is a trait it shares. Is that also the Massachusetts? Or is that the Alabama? I can't remember. But basically it's got a very quick cooldown on that heal, so although it's nothing special, you can actually trigger them in rapid succession, which is still a very, very useful feature. Now this is being played by, and I'm going to say this in the whitest possible fashion, Homie Wit Da Boat. And yeah, I think we'll just call them Homie because that was pretty bad. And yeah, they're going to be playing pretty well in this one overall. But there are going to be one or two mistakes which could, had things turned out differently, potentially cost them very dearly. We're starting off though in a pretty reasonable fashion. They chunked a huge amount of damage out of that cruiser that was spotted at the start, especially with the Citadel. 18-inch gun Citadels do a fair whack of damage, and he's now trying to replicate that on the Smolensk, but the Smolensk is of course a bit trickier in that regard because you're much more likely to get overpens, and certainly once they've smoked up at that point it really is just luck if you actually hit anything or not, because of course if you're not locked onto anything you don't get as good dispersion. He's got to be a little careful here in that we know for a fact that the Asashio is nearby. Those torpedoes are very nasty and very hard to spot. There's also a fair few enemy battleships to the south here, and there's also on top of that yet another destroyer in the Cap, the Benson, although they appear to be just hugging the rock for now, so they're maybe not such a threat. Talking of Asashio torps, yeah, oh dear, that's definitely some incoming. And this is the part where having Georgia's speed boost available would be really very useful, but even more so, it's the part where we see the really first major mistake in that Homie decides they're going to try and put their front turrets on that Vermont, regardless of the knowledge of the incoming torpedo. And although they only eat one, it's a Japanese torp that does a fair whack of damage, so that's really quite bad news all around. Certainly as torpedo damage on the belt counts as heavy damage, and therefore you can heal less of it. So that was definitely a misstep. That was getting greedy for firing those front guns when really they did have the time to try and straighten out and potentially not take that torpedo at all. As a result, well, they've burned one heal, they're about to burn another very shortly, there we go, and there's also still a fair number of angry ships down there that are rather intent on seeing this Ohio go to the bottom. Now, Homie's not the only battleship on this flank, there is the Slava as well. But that Slava is, as you will see Homie himself reference in the chat, still rather playing as though Deadeye was a thing, when of course it isn't. So although you will see that Slava rack up a decent number of kills, and clearly they have done some damage, at the same time they really aren't putting their hit points to good use, and especially in the later stages of the game, and you can see where they're going right now. They're actually driving round behind an island where they can't shoot at anything at all, even. Their positioning is not fantastic overall. So in terms of team play, they could certainly have been doing a heck of a lot better. And instead, they're basically letting all of their allies take the lumps while they sail around at the back and snipe things. So, yeah, of course, removing Deadeye hasn't removed that kind of behaviour, because that kind of behaviour was there well before Deadeye was ever a thing. But Deadeye just tended to reinforce that behaviour, and so I think we're going to see maybe a little more of that post-Deadeye than pre-Deadeye, just on the basis of some people will have now learned that as a habit and maybe aren't going to unlearn it as a habit. With that Slava player, though, who knows? Who knows if that was a thing they'd particularly done previously.
The enemy team has taken the lead.
Overall, this is looking pretty bad right now. Very few ships traded, but the map control, as far as this team is concerned, is pretty awful. They have no caps. They are sort of trying to contest the middle, kind of. This flank over here is largely consisting of Homie getting really quite beat up on, and there's also a radar Minotaur there as well, which I didn't know earlier, but yeah, that is definitely a radar Minotaur. You saw them radar fairly early on, so they don't have smoke to fall back on. So they have to be kind of careful and more than a bit lucky to get away with what they're trying to get away with right now. So there's more torps coming in, but fortunately those aren't sneaky deep water torps. I think those are the Benson torps, so they are not particularly fast and not particularly long ranged. Not the hugest threat. Probably the biggest problem in Homie's immediate future right now is either being cross-map sniped by one of those battleships, and they've actually kind of forced these battleships back a bit, or, well, for whatever reason, they're all falling back towards the mid rather than trying to push this cap. And although there is an allied destroyer on this side, the ZF-6 isn't the scariest destroyer ever by any means. But what's a lot closer is that Smolensk, who parked behind that island there and potentially had the chance to get away and instead hasn't. And lest we forget, of course, Smolensk has got torpedoes. Now, I can't say offhand how good the torp belt protection on this is. I don't know if it's identical to the Montana or not in that regard. But if it's not up to scratch, then yeah, Homie has a bit of a problem here. And there's the torpedoes, and they are going to eat all three of them. Not enough to kill him, unfortunately. Fortunately, rather, not unfortunately. Unfortunate from the Smolensk's perspective, I suppose. And although he is then able to kill that Smolensk, it's actually his secondaries that finish them off after yet another citadel. He's now on perilously low health. This is where not having taken that Asashio torp earlier on is now, you know, looking like an even bigger mistake, because potentially that's what, 20,000 more hit points that they might have right now. Probably not quite 20,000 when you take torp damage into torp belt damage reduction into account, but yeah. Now, after taking those torps from the Smolensk, he's kind of followed it up by ramming the Smolensk armour and potentially leaving himself at a nasty angle relative to that Iowa. But the Iowa got unlucky with their aiming, or they were aiming poorly, or I don't know what, but they didn't really do so much there. And so they're down and out the way. The Minotaur has just nailed that destroyer. So no more Asashio, but the Minotaur themselves has died to an Iowa. And I'm honestly kind of surprised that the Minotaur lasted that long, considering they weren't playing particularly cautiously They were actually being playing fairly aggressively at times there. On the other flank, it's been a complete disaster, as in a bunch of stuff has just died, and they only have a couple of ships left now, but the enemy team is starting to lose numbers as well. Of course, with that massive points lead they've accrued in terms of holding the caps, they don't necessarily have to be that worried, they just have to focus fire on the remaining ships, try and take them out and secure the caps, try and stop the caps from being flipped. And of course Homie is quite low health, so he is a fairly obvious target in that regard. The Des Moines only about half health, so that's another reasonably tasty target. The Slava, who has been sailing around the A-B line for what, over half the game, about half the game at this point, unsurprisingly still quite healthy. So this is what I was talking about in terms of they might be doing some damage, they might be getting some kills, but they are sure as heck not playing in a particularly good way for their team right now. They're playing in a very selfish way, which is, yeah, absolutely putting them in peril. With some of the strange manoeuvrings going on with these enemy battleships that were on this flank, though, I mean, this is actually now starting to come back a little bit. The Republic's down, one of the Iowas died as well. That Hindenburg is looking very low health, and that leaves, what, one enemy Iowa and destroyer, and of course their carrier, who is now gunning for Homie, who is all out of heals at this stage. Now the good news is that Iowa managed to beach themselves at a very bad angle, so again, just a couple of enemy battleships towards the end of this, really playing in a, shall we say, suboptimal manner that is kind of why things are now the way they are. And with that angling, with the rear guns around as well, there we go, yet another citadel and another kill. And oh, by the way, have you noticed it's over 300,000 damage by this point? Yeah, the guns have been behaving really, really well, and that's because this thing actually does have quite good dispersion, I think, and I'm going by what it says on the wiki here, so I hope this is correct, but it shares the same dispersion profile for its guns as HMS Warspite. So it's actually better than the standard American dispersion that you get. So a bit of a missed drop from the Graf Zeppelin there, which is very good news for Homie, because I think a single Citadel AP bomb would have done the trick. Or am I misremembering? Graf Zepp gets AP bombs, right? It's hard to keep track of who has what these days. I'm pretty sure it does. So all that's left is the Graf Zeppelin, and both himself, both Homie and the Slava are actually sitting on 4 kills, so there's a bit of a competition as to who can get the Kraken. I thoroughly know who deserves it, but of course, who deserves it and who is actually going to get it could be two entirely different things. So this was quite the turnaround. I mean, the enemy team still has such a points lead that if this was closer on time, all that Graf Zeppelin would have to do would be to hide, which they're not even really doing properly at the moment. They don't look like they're trying to get any further around that rock, or even trying to head south. Although if they were trying to head south into open water, I mean, their own Kaga could just spot them at that point, so that wouldn't necessarily be a good idea. But yeah, they really, the enemy team just really looked like they were in such a winning position, and then so many of them just kind of derped and started to throw things that went from me watching it at the start and thinking, how the hell is this going to be a win, to this end score screen with exactly 343,000 damage, Confederate, Dev Strike, Close Quarters, Dreadnought, High Caliber, and of course a Kraken. Unsurprisingly, Homie is at the top of their team with over 3,000 base XP, which is not quite double the next best, the Kaga. The Slava there in third, but still 1,600 versus 3,100 is quite a gap. So yeah, if that Slava had been playing any worse in terms of landing shots, this might have been a different outcome. If a couple of the enemy battleships had been more aware of the crossfire that they were positioning themselves into, then this could have been a different outcome. But as it was one hell of a carry and a pretty nice showcase of the Ohio. Not necessarily the secondaries on the Ohio, they did fire a bit, but this wasn't really a very secondary heavy game. But yeah, just showing the devastation that those 18-inch guns can wreak on enemy ships with its better than average accuracy. So, all in all, I thought that was a really good match. Hopefully you agree, and if you do, you can do all the usual things down underneath the video. And of course, as always, stay tuned for more.